Thank you so much for joining me today and welcome to the webinar. Just while we're waiting just a few more seconds, for fun, just put in where you're joining us from in the chat box, just so that I can see where everyone is from. That would be fun. There's a big bug behind me, I know, but I live in Australia. There's bugs here. California, Melbourne. Hopefully you're catching some of the Australian Open. It's beautiful weather down here. It's bucketing here in the Northern Rivers region. Wonderful to have you join us all. My name is Dr. Nirala Jacobi. I'm also known as the SIBO doctor, and I'm so glad you could join me here today for this webinar, The Path to Microbiome Recovery for Optimal Gut Health. Let's get started. There is, of course, a disclaimer. Be advised that this webinar is for educational purposes only and is not intended as medical advice. Please check with your medical professional before starting any new treatment. So a little bit about me. As I've mentioned, I'm known as the SIBO doctor, but my journey really started in about 25 years ago. I became a naturopathic physician in America. I practiced in Montana for a long time before moving over to Australia. And about 13, 14 years ago, I discovered this condition, SIBO, that was virtually unheard of at the time, and endeavored to learn everything about it and started to educate practitioners and the lay audience on this very, very common disorder that is the primary cause of IBS, which of course is a massive issue in the Western countries. About 11% of the world population is estimated to have SIBO, so it's a big deal. But before I became a naturopathic physician and an educator and doing all the things I do around SIBO, of course, I have also a personal story, which many of you will probably, it'll sound familiar, in childhood, having gut issues, lots of constipation, lots of antibiotics in early adulthood for different types of conditions, and just never feeling really right, having a lot of bloating. And I discovered nutrition first, and I became really interested in nutrition because I thought it was the food that was the issue. But then I discovered naturopathic medicine and, of course, fell in love with naturopathic medicine because it is such an incredible system of medicine. And one of the tenets of naturopathic medicine is that the gut is the root of the tree, which is, of course, so beautiful. If the root is not healthy, your whole body can't be healthy, or the tree can't be healthy. So it's a really wonderful metaphor for gut health, is taking care of your roots. So that's really what also made me more interested and passionate about finding out what was wrong with me, and of course, by extension, all of my patients. And I became super fascinated with SIBO, but also the microbiome, because microbiome science is just exploding right now. And it's incredible what we're finding out about the microbiome. So I thought that I'd offer this free webinar to kind of bridge the SIBO and microbiome world, because I know how to talk about SIBO to SIBO sufferers, but the next part often is forgotten by practitioners and so forth, and that is how to really restore your microbiome. This, of course, is an introductory free webinar, but I hope you will learn some really interesting tidbits about how this all ties together. So what I'll talk about in this webinar is, over the years, I've been asked by many patients and practitioners what comes after SIBO treatment. For those of you who have followed me for some time, or have maybe done one of my courses, or have downloaded the SIBO biphasic diet and have utilized this in their SIBO journey, you know that it's two phases, right? The approach that I have created is basically a two-phased approach to SIBO treatment. But a lot of people say, what comes after this? So I will talk about this next step of basically what to do when you've completed SIBO treatment, and is going to, hang on, I'm just having a little technical issue, but it's okay. So how to ease out of SIBO diets, mainly FODMAP diet and the biphasic diet. Also, what to do after SIBO treatment. I will outline the key steps to follow after your SIBO treatment is completed. And there's a lot of misinformation about that. And so I want to just clarify some of that. And then dealing with ongoing symptoms. A lot of people have ongoing digestive issues, even though they test negative for SIBO after treatment. So that's a really common thing. And I have a practice in northern New South Wales where I've seen really thousands of patients over the years with SIBO and IBS. So I'm really, really familiar with this particular issue. So what I talk about, what potential causes can be discovered with this. And then, so of course, the reason I wanted to do this webinar is to discuss microbiome recovery post-treatment, because SIBO treatment, let's face it, can be a bit harsh. There's people that have been on multiple rounds of antibiotics or multiple rounds of herbal antimicrobials. So this is really something that I think needs to be addressed and is in essence phase 3 of the biphasic protocol or the SIBO protocol, because you really do want to support your microbiome after SIBO treatment. I'll talk about the importance of microbiome restoration for also long-term gut health solution. And I estimate that the webinar is about 30 to 45 minutes, just to give you an idea. But if you're having any issues, because you've registered, of course, you will be sent the link. And so you can watch this at your leisure. But why is talking about the microbiome important after SIBO treatment? I've already alluded to the fact that it is harsh. SIBO treatment can be harsh on the microbiome in general. But essentially, SIBO is a microbiome problem because the bacteria that are concentrated in the small intestine that overgrow in the case of SIBO are bacteria that typically are much more concentrated in the large intestine. So let's kind of start with looking at the large intestine versus the small intestine versus the large intestine. So on the left here, you see a picture, a graph of sort of what looks like the small intestine and a teeming sort of environment of bacteria. And then when you look on the right side, you see the colon. So we're just orientating ourselves a little bit in the gut. The small intestine, if you think about it, is not really meant to have a huge amount of bacteria, far less than the large intestine. And that is because this is an area of intense activity of the immune system, of digestion. Obviously, this is where food is broken down and assimilated and absorbed. So you need all the surface area there for your own digestion. And if we have an area that's completely overgrown, that really interferes with the process of digestion. And many of SIBO symptoms can actually be due to this interfered digestion or this disturbed digestion. So in essence, if you've ever seen sort of a graph of Earth's different ecosystems where you have a desert and then you sort of have a semi-arid environment or biome, and then that gives way to grasslands, and that then gives way to forest. That's how you can imagine the progression from your small intestine to your large intestine in terms of bacterial concentration. And so in your large intestine, you're meant to have sort of the equivalent of a rainforest, whereas at the beginning of the small intestine, you're meant to have very, very little bacteria. And this is really where small intestine bacterial overgrowth, or SIBO, is the problem. We're seeing a rainforest where there's not meant to be a rainforest. Now, classic hydrogen dominant SIBO, and I'll talk about that in just a second, is caused by two very specific bacteria called E. coli and Klebsiella, and these are meant to be much more concentrated in the colon. I've seen thousands of patients with SIBO and other IBS causes, and I almost always do stool testing as well as breath testing, just so that I understand what I'm starting with in terms of the microbiome in the large intestine as well. And every single person I've tested, of the thousands I've tested, has had some sort of microbiome imbalance. So this is definitely very common. Now, bear in mind, I'm a gut specialist, so of course I'm going to see people with gut issues, but it is a very, very common issue. The breath test that we do for SIBO detects the type of gases that are produced by these different organisms. So these are the different types of SIBO gases that we check for in breath testing. So we have hydrogen, as I mentioned, that's being produced by bacterial fermentation of mostly fermentable carbohydrates in the upper gut if they're overgrown. So the food that you eat is now being consumed by these other bacteria that are producing hydrogen. Then hydrogen is being used to produce methane. And methanogens are organisms that are not really classified as bacteria, but they're sort of ancient species that produce methane. And methane is very, very constipating. So the classic picture of somebody with EMO, or intestinal methanogen overgrowth, which is my preferred name for SIBO that's methane dominant, is constipation, and sometimes long-term, many decades of constipation. So methanogens can use hydrogen to produce methane. And then the other gas that's sort of a smaller player, if you will, is hydrogen sulfide that's also produced by hydrogen. So all of this happens in your small intestine when you have bacterial overgrowth. When we do a breath test, we measure hydrogen and methane. Hydrogen sulfide is not really measurable yet. There is one lab in America that does that, but I really hope that hydrogen sulfide testing is going to be available much more sort of on a broader scale before we just all rush to one lab. So hydrogen sulfide is usually associated with diarrhea-dominant SIBO. So if that's not you, then this might not even be a problem for you. But in the world of SIBO, hydrogen sulfide is often discussed, and there's a lot of confusion around if it's in the large intestine versus the small intestine. And this is sort of beyond the scope of this webinar. But suffice it to say that these are the three gases that can be checked. And if you're positive for any one of them, you can receive treatment for SIBO for your symptoms. And classic SIBO symptoms, of course, as we all know, if you are familiar with SIBO, are all the classic IBS symptoms. So either alternating diarrhea and constipation or just diarrhea. A lot of bloating happens with SIBO. A lot of food intolerances, a lot of other IBS symptoms like cramping, histamine issues can also occur. So it's a real big problem for people that have ongoing digestive symptoms. And if you fit this bill and you have not ever been tested, this is something really simple and easy you can do at home, and different labs exist in different countries that can offer this test for you. Now, in terms of SIBO treatment, if you have joined me here, it's likely you've either already purchased the biphasic diet or you've heard about me. But again, I welcomed everyone at the beginning. If you've never heard of me, I'm really happy to have you here. I am the creator of the SIBO biphasic diet, which is a sort of a 3-month protocol that goes through different phases for what I find the best results for SIBO treatment. It is the biphasic protocol is using the biphasic diet, but other practitioners use just a basic low FODMAP diet. And for those of you who are not familiar with FODMAPs, that stands for fermentable oligosaccharides, disaccharides, monosaccharides, and polyols. So it's a mouthful of science, and it is basically the gassy stuff in food, and a lot of it is really healthy food, but it is very, very fermentable. And I'm not saying it's unhealthy. Please don't hear that. It's just if you have SIBO, these are the foods that contain FODMAPs are the ones that cause the most symptoms. So my SIBO treatment, in essence, is three-part approach where you have the diet, you use herbal antimicrobials or antibiotics that are very specific for your type of SIBO. And then following on with that, once you've cleared SIBO, you want to really prevent relapse, because it is very, very frequent that I see people that relapse. Now, I put cause specific. I'll elaborate on that in a moment, but there are different causes for SIBO. Not everyone has SIBO for the same reasons. So some people need prokinetics, for example, which is a type of medicine that improves the motility of the digestive tract so that the body can, or the gut can actually flush out bacteria. Some people need that, some people don't need that, and will get worse with prokinetics. So this is where, again, it's beyond the scope of this. It's part of my course that I'll tell you about in a minute. But more on this 3 months biphasic protocol is the first phase is usually 4 weeks. The second phase is about 8 weeks, and you use also antimicrobials in that second phase. And then phase one supplements are given throughout the treatments as they are digestive and immune support. That's just a summary. Now, if you have SIBO, I want to kind of move on from this because this is not really a SIBO webinar. It's Beyond SIBO is the title. So, but if you have SIBO and you've never heard of the SIBO Success Plan, this is my wonderful brainchild in terms of how you can actually help yourself with SIBO. So it covers what is SIBO, all the way SIBO treatment, testing for SIBO. But then I also go into food intolerances, healing leaky gut, how to actually manage your anxiety and work with your nervous system. And then I also talk about symptom relief. And one more slide on that is the SIBO Mastery Program, which is a certification course for health professionals. So that's all the SIBO stuff. But let's talk about how to get off the SIBO biphasic diet or the low FODMAP diet. So ideally, when you are done with your treatment for SIBO and you are done with your antimicrobials, the first thing you want to do, and what I usually recommend, unless you are 100% symptom-free of SIBO and IBS, you want to retest, meaning a breath test. And again, this is something very simple you can do at home and send into the lab. And it's very easy to find out whether or not you've moved the dial when it comes to the gases that are being produced and if you are truly SIBO-free. And this is most important for when you have actually, cleared SIBO. And as you'll see in a moment, this is very frequent actually, where SIBO is clear, but people still have symptoms. And the problem is that a lot of practitioners, well-intentioned practitioners, just basically don't retest and then put people on these long-term antimicrobials, even though the problem is no longer SIBO. So I'm very passionate about this, that it's not too expensive to do a retest so that you really know that you are done. So what are we going to do? We're going to, once SIBO is clear, it is actually time to broaden the diet. And that's what we want. We want to have a diet that's healthy and as broad and diverse as we can make it, because not only is that part of the joys of life, but it's also important for your microbiome. There's actually a great show on Netflix right now about plant-based diets and how they affect the microbiome, called "You Are What You Eat," and it's very interesting to see how they've approached that. But it's well known that the more plants you eat, the more diverse your microbiome, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But the first things you're going to do is you're going to increase the very things that you have been asked to avoid, of course, because they can make SIBO symptoms worse because they're very, very fermentable. So things like sweet potato. White potato is allowed because it's not as fermentable as sweet potato. So you might want to add in the sweet potato, but also brown and red rice and quinoa. Quinoa is actually allowed on the biphasic diet as well, but you can just start to increase the amounts of that. Buckwheat is a wonderful addition as well. Lentils are also there, and I've added those into the biphasic diet as well. There's a very specific way that you can make lentils very digestible. And if you have not received that free download, we'll add some links into the chat for the SIBO Success Plan and for the Mastery course. And if you go to the SIBOdoctor.com, I have a handout of how to make fiber and fiber-rich foods more digestible, and it teaches you how to sprout certain foods before cooking them, and that makes them way more digestible. Because the amount of times I've heard I can't eat legumes, they make me gassy and bloated, is monumental, the amount of times. And oftentimes it's a problem with the fermentable carbohydrates that are much, much lessened with the process of soaking and sprouting. So have a look in the chat box, or the either the Q&A, or let's put it in the chat box, these different links. Then sweeteners, some sweeteners are allowed, but very little, more like stevia and so forth. There are some sweeteners that are very high in fermentable carbohydrates, like xylitol, for example. Erythritol is a little bit better. But then you can start adding in some maple syrup and see if you can tolerate that. Honey can be a little tricky, because honey, depending on the different variety of honey, some are very, very high in fructose, and that can also be more associated with more symptoms. So just be aware of that. And personally, I'm a big fan of dark rye sourdough bread. And if you're gluten intolerant, of course, this is not something for you. But I am of German origin, so I grew up with pumpernickel. But turns out that dark rye, and especially things like pumpernickel, where the rye is in its whole form, is really important for regrowing certain species. It contains 3 different types of prebiotics that are specific for keystone species, such as Roseburia intestinalis, which is a bacteria that is associated with consuming hydrogen sulfide. So if you've got hydrogen sulfide, SIBO or LIBO, large intestine, you may really benefit from including rye in your diet, because it's so great for regrowing this one species that can take down some of these hydrogen sulfide levels. That's all covered in the microbiome course. Now, let's kind of have a flow diagram of what to do after SIBO treatment. As I said, the first thing you're going to do is to retest. Let's say the test is still positive. Let's say something happened and your treatment did not work. First thing you're going to do is you're going to look at the levels of before and after. So when you were diagnosed with SIBO and now the retest, if the numbers have come down greatly, but you're still positive, you might just want to repeat the protocol, or you want to consider a different antimicrobial. And those are all covered in the SIBO success plan as to how to go about this. Let's say you retested and yay, the SIBO test is finally negative. The next thing you're going to, well, if you have still gut issues, let's say that unfortunately you still have gut issues, may not be the same. Your bloating may be better, but you may have still a lot of bowel infrequency, for example, or alternating bowel patterns. What you want to do is you want to consider other causes that I will talk about in a moment. But if you are negative and your symptoms are gone, you want to really focus on prevention of relapse. And that is by improving your gut microbiome, right, which we'll talk about in a moment as well. And you really want to find out what the underlying cause is of SIBO. Now, in my practice, I often start with, besides SIBO treatment, I also look at what caused a person's SIBO from the very beginning so that I have an idea of how to help them, and not just at the end. So let's talk about what actually causes SIBO. And then we'll come back to considering the other causes, and then we'll talk about the microbiome. So number one is you might have something going on with impaired digestion. So what do I mean by that? Your stomach makes stomach acid that has several functions. It is the primary digestive juice for unraveling the long strands of protein. It starts to break them down a little bit so that your pancreatic enzymes can act upon them and break them down further. But the other function of stomach acid is actually it kills bacteria. And we know that pretty much only one bacteria can survive stomach acid or can live in an acid environment. And that, of course, is H. pylori. And it survives that by creating a little alkaline cloud. So it also doesn't like the acid, but it is something that can really, like if you have low stomach acid, which is quite common, it can cause SIBO because bacteria are allowed to survive that vat of stomach acid that's meant to be existing there. It's not that common to develop SIBO from it, but it can definitely give you symptoms as well. But for this reason, it's considered an underlying cause of SIBO that you're just not killing bacteria. Same with pancreatic enzymes. They also have a bacteriostatic effect. And then bile as well. All of these are juices that keep the small intestine relatively sterile so that it can concentrate on breaking down your food and the important task of absorbing and assimilating your nutrients. The second, maybe the most common and most important underlying cause of SIBO is something happened to the motility of the small intestine. So let's unpack that for just a minute. So your small intestine is, for the reasons I've mentioned, it's really important that bacteria don't linger there. And so the infinite wisdom of the body has created something called the migrating motor complex, which is known as the housekeeper wave. And this is a contraction that moves through the small intestine to sweep everything out. Now, different things can affect this migrating motor complex. And one of these very common issues is having had a case of food poisoning before. That can affect your migrating motor complex to where you even months later can develop IBS and SIBO. Other underlying factors that impair the small intestinal motility can be hypothyroidism, can be extreme stress, can be chronic infections, can be mold exposure. So you see how this is quite complicated to find out what the issue is. Now, luckily, also in the resource section on the SIBOdoctor.com, there's a free questionnaire that you can download that helps you kind of pinpoint a little bit more what might be your underlying cause of SIBO. And that's typically then given to the practitioner so that they can help you create or construct a great treatment plan for this. The last underlying cause of SIBO is something happening where that flow through the digestive tract is not just impaired in the small intestine, but also through the whole digestive tract because of adhesions or scar tissues that have formed on the outside of your gut and are kind of kinking the garden hose is the analogy I like to use, and are attaching themselves on the outside of your gut wall, and it just impairs how food is moving through. And so anytime the flow is impaired, things will stagnate. So I liken this like a river. If the river becomes too stagnant, basically algae forms, right? You're going to have algae blooms. Same thing happens. Now, what causes these adhesions Anyone that has endometriosis will know what adhesions are like, but also people that have had abdominal surgery. So maybe you've had your appendix out, or you had your gallbladder out, or you had a hysterectomy. So the numerous routine abdominal surgeries can also trigger more scar tissue formation. What to do about that is all beyond the scope of this webinar, because that is covered in the SIBO success plan. But I just wanted to mention that it's important to address these underlying causes so that you prevent relapse. So let's go back to this graph where we look at what's happening after SIBO treatment. So you tested negative, but you're still symptomatic. Let's talk about what could be the case of that. So we all know what that feels like, right? The buttons are straining and we can't get our pants closed, and it's frustrating. The amount of pictures I have of side shots of bloated bellies from my patients, I probably have a whole gallery of them. And so it's a really common problem to be bloated. Now, we just talked about SIBO and how this can cause bloating, but like we said, you tested negative. So what could be the problem here? The problem can be that you have still some residual inflammation from the effects of SIBO. So remember how I talked about hydrogen gas and methane gas and hydrogen sulfide gas being produced in the small intestine? Well, they can be really damaging to your small intestine. And your small intestine has a shaggy carpet of finger-like protrusions called the villi. And on the top of the villi are microvilli that have what are called brush border enzymes that do the last step of digestion for you. And the gases that are produced with SIBO are very, very damaging on the brush border, and not only damage these enzymes, but can also cause leaky gut. So oftentimes it just is a matter of healing the gut a little bit more. Another reason you could still be symptomatic is that your digestion hasn't been corrected. So you're still lacking different enzymes. You might be deficient in bile. You might have hydrochloric acid deficiency, that type of thing. So that's also really common. And then stress and anxiety, right? I mean, we've all experienced a lot of this. A lot more, I think, in the last few years. I've had a lot more relapses in my patients, and I've had to focus a lot more on that part, on the gut-brain axis, which is also beyond the scope of this webinar, but it is a real thing. It's like your gut talks to your brain and vice versa. And when you have stress and anxiety and you're constantly in the in the fight mode, so the sympathetic overdrive of your nervous system that's meant to help you out of an extremely stressful situation. If your nervous system is constantly activated like that, the blood flow, first of all, the blood flow from your gut is shunted away from your gut towards the periphery so that you can run away from this perceived threat. And so really about fostering the rest and digest, right, is what we want to do with that. And lastly, what else can cause symptoms, even though your test is negative, is microbiome imbalances. So this is now where I transition into talking about the importance of your gut microbiome. As I mentioned earlier, when it comes to the microbiome, the small intestine is supposed to be more desert-like, or let's say rural community, a house here and there, but they've got a good community, sparsely populated. And then as you go down towards the colon, it's much more city life, right? Lots and lots of organisms there. They contain similar bacteria, but the distribution of the bacteria are very different. The reason I call this webinar Beyond SIBO is that many, many people in my experience actually have undiagnosed microbiome imbalances that are profoundly affecting their gut and overall health. And not just gut health, but all major diseases have now been found to have a link to the microbiome. Diseases like autoimmune diseases, diabetes, depression and anxiety, neurological issues, neurodegenerative disorders. So really astronomical levels of these conditions are starting to emerge. And so I really do believe that we are in the midst of a great extinction event in our microbiome. And that is why I'm so passionate about teaching people about the importance of microbiome health, not only because I had my own issues. As I mentioned, when I was a child, a baby, for a whole year, I had failure to thrive. I was bottle fed and then had a lot of antibiotics. And so when I entered this field, I came with this thirst for knowledge. And in my time as a practitioner, like I said, research into the microbiome has really exploded. So I've been like a kid in a proverbial candy store, although of course we don't want candy stores, right? Something different. Okay, so this is a funny graph to demonstrate that our microbiome has really, really changed over the course of human evolution. Now, 10,000 years ago, we had the agricultural revolution, which already started this change into more urbanized settings slowly, and also agricultural systems and different diets. And that wasn't as much of a different or a huge change, obviously, than the Industrial Revolution, which really affected our microbiome greatly. Now, granted, of course, some for the better because of better sanitation, but also we started seeing the beginning of processed foods and also medications that profoundly affects the microbiome, such as antibiotics and sedentary lifestyles and modern birthing practices, where now it's pretty routine to have a cesarean, where you're not really picking up the microbiome at birth. Our ancestors used to have a far more diverse and robust microbiome, and estimated to contain several thousand species. Nowadays, the average human microbiome has shrunk down to about 150 to 200 species. If you're doing a stool test, and the testing that I recommend that actually counts species, it will tell you how many species you have. So it is a big deal, and that's pretty normal now. Now, granted, we maybe don't need as much as we needed back then because our diet was very different. Also, in terms of parasites and in terms of food that maybe went off and things. So we needed a lot more protection from the elements and stuff. So when you have way more bacteria, that also gives you a different immune response. So there are different reasons, but it is a profound change from thousands to down to maybe 150 to 200. So let's talk about why is this so important? What does the microbiome actually do for us? As I mentioned, it actually primes our immune system. It is important for the baby to have some bacteria that teaches the immune system that actually is right underneath our gut mucosa, constantly sampling our microbiome to understand whether or not it's something to be concerned about. And about 99% of the job of our immune system in the gut is meant to be just not reacting to the food that we're eating. So it is an important thing. 80% of our immune system lives in our gut. So that priming of our immune system, where it's telling the immune system to stay quiet or to react, is very important. It also is important to keep things moving. It's associated with improving gut motility and regularity. The microbiome is also producing vitamins and helps to absorb vitamins and minerals. It helps with weight management. Some great studies have come out with microbiome transplants from an obese person, or obese mouse, into skinny mice. And just with that, the skinny mouse gained weight. So we know that the microbiome has a lot to do with inability to lose weight as well. So I cover all of that in my microbiome course. It activates what are called polyphenols, and polyphenols are chemicals or phytochemicals, which are plant-based or antioxidants and phytochemicals in plants that are extremely important for us and are involved in longevity and anti-inflammation. So it's important for that. It also produces neurotransmitters and hormones. Neurotransmitters like GABA, or gamma aminobutyric acid, which is the chill and relax neurotransmitter, right? So very important. It helps control blood sugar, a big link to diabetes there. It controls inflammation, perhaps the most important part of that, because all chronic disease is associated with inflammation. And then finally, about 20% of your daily energy comes from your microbiome. So this is why I'm preaching the importance of a healthy microbiome, because if you can manage all of that, you've got a great foundation for a long and healthy life. Now, with all the research coming out about the importance of a healthy microbiome, modern medicine is very aware of the increase in antibiotic resistance, which has come about with the overuse of antibiotics. So not just for diseases, but also it's, as you may know, it's put into livestock feed to fatten animals. But the model of good versus bad is really singling out one villain, one particular bacteria, and then let's create a drug to kill that one bacteria. An example is E. coli in urinary tract infection, or streptococcus for strep throat, different skin bacteria that are involved in acne, for example. And while antibiotics have undoubtedly saved millions of lives in more serious diseases, we are now seeing the downside of this approach. We're seeing far more antibiotic resistance and loss of species and loss of bacterial communities. And bacterial communities is where it's at. And I think this is the new frontier of microbiome science, is not just about one bacteria and what it produces, but how communities keep each other in check. And the cross-feeding of different species. So one bacteria will produce a metabolite or a substance that is important for the growth of another. And so just like the symbiotic relationships we see in forests and in different, basically in different ecosystems, we see the same in the microbiome. And I personally am not surprised by that, because I think microcosm definitely mirrors what's happening on the macrocosm. So if you can reestablish communities in your gut, I think this is where it's at in terms of health and prevention of disease. So a little bit more about this. When you actually look at the microbiome, it's kind of categorized into these different, well, categories or phyla of bacteria, and these are the main phyla in humans. We have Firmicutes. Of that group is we have important keystone species like Faecalibacterium, but also Lactobacillus is in that group. That's about 45% of your microbiome. Second, it's Bacteroidetes, which is also an important phylum or group of or category of bacteria. That's about 40% of your microbiome. So in each category, you have hundreds of different species potential. Actinobacteria comprises about 10% of your microbiome, and that includes Bifidobacterium. And Verruca microbia, it's a funny name, but it is includes an organism that's really, really important to maintain the health of your gut mucosa. And the gut mucosa is what prevents bacteria from invading us. So it's really, really important. And then proteobacteria, you see there, is just a small ball that's about 2% of your microbiome. Proteobacteria are normal inhabitants of this community. But what happens with SIBO is we see this shrinkage of different groups. It might not be Firmicutes, but we see this massive increase of proteobacteria in the small intestine, because E. coli and Klebsiella are both part of that group of bacteria. So when that happens, when we see this imbalance in these communities, we start to see problems like SIBO, but also overgrowth in the large intestine. So this is why I want to talk to you about this course that I created. And why I created this course, because I think there's a lot of confusion and a misunderstanding about that you can just take a probiotic, for example, just to restore your microbiome, which is so silly because, probiotics comprise maybe 2% of your microbiome. So just taking a probiotic isn't going to regrow what you need to regrow. And the reason I called it regrowing the garden in your gut, because it really is this wonderful piece of real estate you've got in your body that you have direct control over, and especially with how you're feeding it, obviously. So what you will learn in this course is how to more fun facts about your microbiome and what makes up your microbiome and the keystone species that are really important, and how to really target those species and how to regrow individual important species like Faecalibacterium that I mentioned, or Roseburia, or Akkermansia, or all these wonderful species that we're just discovering that do really important things for us. And what are some of the new innovative strategies that are coming out in science to incorporate this kind of thought of we need communities, we don't just need individual strains. The second lesson is about knowing your specific microbiome type. And you'll learn about why it's important to know what you're actually producing and how it's influencing your specific health. You can look at diversity, overgrowth of specific bacteria. We'll talk about important harmful bacteria or bacterial metabolites such as histamine and hydrogen sulfide, and something called LPS, which is a massive inflammatory trigger and can also cause depression. And we also cover very, very important healthy metabolites like short-chain fatty acids, and which ones are really important for you, and how you can manipulate this. So it's really like a do-it-yourself project of how to rewild your microbiome. Lesson 3 is about what harms your microbiome. It's not just the food that you eat, but also identifying which lifestyle factors you need to change to optimize your microbiome, which can make a huge difference. And how stress, like I mentioned, can affect the gut-brain axis, and which medications and specific food ingredients can really harm the microbiome. And let's just kind of have a look at that. Oh, here I am again in the middle of the circle. It's a fun little thing you can do with PowerPoint. I just discovered it. So here I am in the middle of the SAD diet wheel. The SAD diet stands for the Standard American or Australian diet, which is just loaded with sugar, genetically modified organisms or GMOs, pesticides and herbicides. The animal products that are consumed in the SAD diet are typically higher in antibiotics, higher than organically raised, for example, and have also more hormones in them. Alcohol can also affect your microbiome. Highly processed foods, of course, that contain preservatives, artificial sweeteners, and emulsifiers. Emulsifiers actually have been found to be absolutely devastating for the microbiome. And of course, lack of fiber. It is estimated that the average American or Australian gets less than a third of the daily recommended dose of fiber. So this is one of the reasons this is so detrimental. But in the course, we go through all of these different baddies, as I call them. You'll also learn how to weed, seed, and feed your garden. Now, weeding, that makes sense, right? You do want to kind of be aware of the amount of different bacteria that are more detrimental, so they have overgrown in this community, such as the non-beneficial bacteria, I should say, such as D-sulfur vibrio or different organisms that may be in just too high amount. Seeding is a touch of a misnomer because you cannot seed with taking probiotics, right? As I've mentioned, it makes up 1 to 2% of your entire microbiome, but it still can be super beneficial to take probiotics. Why? Because what we know now about probiotics is that they are what are called biological response modifiers. And that's a fancy word for saying they can actually help regrow your own species. They have this sort of fertilizing and stimulating effect on your microbiome. So I go through different probiotics and what you want to maybe focus on for your specific microbiome type. And the course includes also a dispensary guide. So wherever you are in the world, you will get specific recommendations for what you might need. And then feeding refers to the fertilization of your garden with different prebiotic foods and different prebiotic supplements that might be really specific to affect your microbiome type. And then we conclude with the healthy microbiome diet. Here I look a little manic, I will admit. I've just returned from my local farmer's market, and that's kind of how I feel when I return from the farmer's market. So I talk about what you can do to improve your diet. Now, if you're on this webinar, you're no stranger to understanding how the diet affects your microbiome. Probably you're following different people and you are looking at microbiome issues and all of that. And I understand that everybody is on their journey, but you have some understanding that just eating the standard diet is probably not going to help your gut. One of the really profound quotes that has come out of the microbiome project or the American Gut Project came from Dr. Rob Knight. I saw him at a conference a few years ago, and he said that the single greatest predictor of a healthy microbiome is the diversity of plants in your diet. So I really elaborate on this in this lesson for sure. Now, remember how I told you that I had all those gut symptoms before I became a naturopathic doctor, and you know, how few species people have, about 150 to 200. Well, the proof is in the pudding. And maybe this is why this picture looks a little manic, is because of all the stool tests I have done, I am the proud owner or custodian, I should say, of the most diverse microbiome I've ever seen. I have over 300 different species in my microbiome. And that, yes, that is a loaf of dark rice sourdough. So if you're not gluten intolerant or have celiac disease, please consider this. Anyways, so yes, a healthy microbiome diet. The microbiome course is also comes with some bonuses. You get the microbiome handbook with quick references and recipes. You also get the online dispensary, so the guesswork is taken out and you don't have to spend tons of money on expensive supplements that you may not need. And again, if you live in a country, we're pretty much continent specific. We have recommendations for America, for Australia, and for Europe mainly. But there are some great links there for different products that I have used and recommended to my patients in these different places. So I see people worldwide, so I have a pretty good understanding of what's out there. And then also now this is a new thing that we're doing. I have a big public group called SIBO Lifestyle that has about 16,000 members or so, but we are now moving more to a closed Facebook group. So when you purchase this course, you will have access or you will be eligible to join Dr. Jacobi's Gut Recovery Group, which is more curated content and moderated content. It got sort of a little out of hand with spam on the public group. So I've decided to just offer a private group for people that actually are very serious about restoring their microbiome and restoring or recovering from SIBO. So anyone who has purchased the biphasic diet or any of my courses is eligible to join this group.